My beloved child, do not scroll away from this moment. Stay here, because something has been stirring beneath the silence, and what you are about to hear may touch a place in your heart you have been trying not to visit. Today, someone connected deeply to your journey reached an emotional breaking point. Your soulmate was in tears, but the reason was not what anyone around them would have guessed. It was not simply sadness. It was not weakness. It was not because they had suddenly stopped believing in love. Those tears came because something they had been trying to control finally became too powerful to hide. A truth they pushed down for far too long rose to the surface, and once it did, they could no longer pretend that you had not changed them. There was a moment today when everything around them seemed ordinary. Life continued. People spoke. Phones buzzed. Responsibilities waited. Yet somewhere inside your soulmate, the world had gone strangely quiet. They were physically present, but their thoughts had already traveled somewhere else. They were thinking about you. Not casually. Not as a passing memory. They were replaying moments they once dismissed, words they misunderstood, silences they interpreted incorrectly, and feelings they had refused to name. What overwhelmed them was the sudden realization that many of the things they thought they understood about this connection were incomplete. And when that realization struck, something inside them cracked open. You may wonder why this happened today. Why now? Why would emotion arrive after so much distance, uncertainty, or hesitation? Because sometimes the heart understands something long before the mind is willing to admit it. Your soulmate has carried an internal argument for longer than you realize. One part of them wanted to move forward without looking back. Another part kept turning toward you. One voice told them to be practical. Another whispered that some connections cannot be measured by logic alone. They tried to silence that second voice. They tried distraction. They tried pretending they were fine. They tried telling themselves that time would eventually make everything simple. But today, something happened that made pretending impossible. It began with a memory so small that anyone else might have overlooked it. Perhaps it was a song, a familiar phrase, a place, a photograph, or even the way someone smiled. Whatever triggered it was ordinary, but what followed was not. Your soulmate suddenly remembered the way you made them feel seen. They remembered something about your presence that they had taken for granted when it was happening. And in that instant, they recognized the difference between someone simply being around them and someone reaching parts of their heart they rarely reveal. That distinction hit them harder than expected. The tears came slowly at first. They fought them. They looked away. They tried to regain control because they did not want anyone to notice. But emotion does not always ask permission before revealing what the soul has been carrying. They were not crying because you had failed them. They were crying because they began to understand how much you may have been carrying quietly while they were still trying to figure themselves out. They saw your patience differently. They saw your silence differently. They remembered moments when you could have chosen anger but instead stepped back. Moments when you could have demanded explanations but allowed space. Moments when your heart may have been tired, yet you still cared. And this is where the story becomes deeper, because what your soulmate realized today was not only about you. It was about themselves. They recognized a pattern. Whenever something became emotionally real, they became cautious. Whenever the possibility of losing control appeared, they pulled back. Whenever they sensed that another person could truly matter, fear disguised itself as logic. They told themselves they were protecting their peace, when sometimes they were protecting old wounds. They told themselves they needed certainty, when the truth was that certainty felt safer than vulnerability. Your soulmate began remembering choices they made from fear. Words they did not say. Messages they almost sent. Conversations they postponed. Feelings they minimized because admitting them would have required courage. And suddenly, the distance between what they felt and what they expressed became painfully clear. That realization brought tears because they saw how much time can pass while two hearts wait for one person to finally become honest with themselves. But there is something else you need to understand. Your soulmate's tears were not a sign that everything is hopeless. Quite the opposite. Sometimes tears appear when resistance is losing its grip. Sometimes the heart cries when a wall is beginning to fall. They were emotional because something inside them is changing. A truth they kept pushing away has become impossible to ignore. They may still be confused about what happens next, but they are no longer able to comfortably return to the version of themselves that pretended this connection meant nothing. You have felt changes too, haven't you? There have been moments when you wondered whether you should completely release the story, close the emotional door, and stop trying to understand what all of this meant. You may have grown tired of interpreting silence. You may have asked yourself why something that felt so meaningful could also feel so complicated. At times you may have questioned your own intuition. You may have wondered whether you imagined the depth, whether you cared more, whether the connection only existed strongly in your heart. Yet there were also moments when something inside you refused to call it meaningless. Not because you wanted to chase anyone, and not because you needed someone else to complete you, but because certain experiences leave an imprint that cannot be explained by simple attraction. You learned something through this person. You discovered your capacity to care, to wait, to set boundaries, to forgive, and perhaps most importantly, to choose yourself without becoming bitter. That last part matters more than you know. The divine lesson surrounding this connection has never been about losing yourself while waiting for another person. It has been about becoming clearer, stronger, more discerning, more grounded in your worth. Love that belongs in your life should not require you to abandon your dignity. It should not demand endless chasing. It should not ask you to shrink your needs so another person never has to face theirs. And today, your soulmate began to understand something similar from the opposite side of the connection. They started asking themselves a question they had avoided for a long time. What if I misunderstood the person who cared about me most sincerely? That question unsettled them. Because once they asked it, memories came rushing back with different meanings. A conversation they once considered unimportant suddenly felt significant. A moment when you became quiet suddenly made sense. A time when you withdrew no longer looked like indifference. It looked like someone protecting a heart that had already given enough. They began seeing that your distance may not have meant you stopped caring. It may have meant you finally understood that love cannot survive where only one person carries all the emotional weight. This realization made them emotional because they expected you to always remain exactly where they left you. And now they are no longer sure. There is a quiet fear inside them that your heart has changed. Not turned cold, but matured. They sense that you may no longer respond to half-effort the way you once did. They sense that whatever happens next will require honesty. No vague signals. No confusing energy. No expecting you to understand feelings that are never expressed. Somewhere deep inside, they know the next chapter cannot be built with the same behavior that complicated the last one. That understanding brought another wave of tears. Your soulmate was not only grieving what happened. They were grieving what could have happened differently if they had been braver. They thought about possibilities. Conversations that never occurred. Moments you might have shared. Memories you could have created. And for the first time, instead of blaming timing, circumstances, other people, or confusion, they began looking inward. That is a powerful turning point. It is easier to miss someone than to admit you contributed to losing closeness with them. It is easier to romanticize memories than to confront the choices that created distance. It is easier to say, maybe it wasn't meant to be, than to ask, was I afraid when love asked me to become vulnerable? Today, your soulmate asked themselves the harder question. And the answer shook them. They realized that you may have seen through parts of them they worked very hard to hide. You noticed when they were uncertain even when they acted confident. You sensed when something was wrong even when they said everything was fine. You recognized the tenderness beneath their defenses. Being seen that deeply can feel beautiful, but to someone who has spent years protecting themselves, it can also feel terrifying. So they stepped backward when part of them wanted to step closer. They acted distant when they wanted reassurance. They waited for you to prove something they were too afraid to ask for directly. And then, when you became quieter, they wondered why. Today, they finally connected those pieces. But the greatest reason they cried has not yet been revealed. Because there was another thought that entered their heart after all those memories surfaced. A thought so sharp that they had to sit with it in silence. They imagined you being loved properly by someone else. Not as punishment. Not as jealousy alone. Something deeper happened. They pictured another person recognizing your loyalty without needing to lose it first. They imagined someone listening when you speak, valuing the things about you that often go unnoticed, making you feel chosen instead of uncertain. And suddenly your soulmate understood what they had been risking. It is one thing to assume someone cares. It is another to realize that person is not obligated to wait forever. The thought of you moving forward did not make them emotional because they believe they own your heart. They know they do not. It made them emotional because they began to recognize the value of what they may have failed to nurture. That difference is important. Real love cannot be possession. It must be appreciation. And sometimes appreciation arrives only when someone finally understands that another person's presence is a gift, not a guarantee. You need to hear this clearly. Do not use their emotional awakening as a reason to abandon your own growth. Do not rush backward simply because someone else may finally be waking up. Their tears are part of their journey. Their realization belongs to them. Your responsibility is not to rescue them from the consequences of their uncertainty. Your responsibility is to remain honest about what kind of love you are willing to receive now. Because you have changed too. The version of you that entered this connection may have been willing to accept ambiguity for longer. You may once have searched endlessly for signs, explanations, or hidden meanings. You may have believed that if you loved deeply enough, eventually everything would become clear. But the person you are becoming understands that clarity is itself an act of love. Consistency is love. Presence is love. Communication is love. Respect is love. A connection cannot live on intensity alone. It needs truth. And your soulmate sensed that truth today. Something about your energy, your distance, your growth, or simply the passage of time made them realize that you are not standing still. You have been rebuilding parts of yourself they may not even know were wounded. You have been learning to let silence teach you instead of destroy you. You have been rediscovering who you are when you are not waiting for someone else's decision. That is what frightened them. Not because your strength pushes love away, but because your strength changes the terms of what you will accept. They suddenly understood that if they return to your life emotionally, they cannot return casually. They cannot bring confusion and call it connection. They cannot bring occasional attention and call it commitment. They cannot bring fear and ask you to translate it into love. Something must be different. And deep inside, they know it. There is a strange beauty in this moment because neither of you is exactly where you once were. The story has changed even in the silence. You have learned things they do not know about. They have confronted feelings you have not witnessed. Life has been shaping both of you separately, and now a question is beginning to rise. What happens when two people meet again after becoming different versions of themselves? Do not answer that question too quickly. Because another revelation came to your soulmate today, one that changed the emotional meaning of everything. They remembered something you said long ago. Maybe it was a simple sentence. Maybe you told them you only wanted honesty. Maybe you said you never expected perfection. Maybe you told them that what hurt was not the truth but uncertainty. At the time, they may not have fully understood why those words mattered. Today, they did. They realized you were never asking them to have every answer. You were asking them to be real. And that realization broke something open inside them because they recognized how many times they withheld truth while waiting until they could present a perfect version of themselves. They thought they needed to become certain before speaking. They thought they needed to control the outcome. They thought vulnerability would make them weak. Now they understand that silence can sometimes wound more deeply than an imperfect confession. This does not mean they are suddenly fearless. They are not. Even now, part of them is afraid. Afraid you will not respond the way they hope. Afraid too much time has passed. Afraid you have already emotionally closed the door. Afraid that telling you everything will expose feelings they can never take back. But another part of them has become more afraid of never telling you. And that is why today matters. Their tears marked the moment when silence began to hurt more than honesty. There was an internal conversation happening inside them that no one else could hear. One part said, "Leave it alone." Another replied, "You have already left it alone for too long." One part warned, "What if they reject you?" Another whispered, "What if you lose them because you never tried?" And then your name crossed their mind again. This time, they did not push it away. They let themselves feel everything. The affection. The regret. The longing. The gratitude. The fear. And underneath all of it, something surprisingly peaceful. Because once they stopped fighting their emotions, they realized that loving someone does not always mean controlling what happens next. Sometimes it means becoming brave enough to tell the truth and allowing the other person the freedom to decide what to do with it. That understanding changed the energy of their tears. They were no longer only tears of regret. They became tears of release. For months, perhaps longer, your soulmate has carried conversations inside themselves that never reached you. They imagined how you might react. They rehearsed words and then abandoned them. They typed things and erased them. They considered reaching out and then found reasons to wait. But today, waiting began to feel heavier than speaking. And something may be forming inside them now. A decision. Not necessarily a dramatic gesture. Not necessarily something public. But a real decision. To stop hiding behind uncertainty. To stop asking time to solve what only courage can address. To stop pretending your absence has no effect. Yet before you imagine what that decision means, there is something heaven wants you to understand about your own heart. You are allowed to care and still have boundaries. You are allowed to hope without putting your life on hold. You are allowed to listen without immediately saying yes. You are allowed to forgive without returning to the exact same dynamic. You are allowed to love someone while requiring that love to become healthier before it comes closer. Your soulmate's tears do not create an obligation for you. They reveal a transformation happening within them. What comes next depends not only on emotion but action. Remember that. Because strong feelings can create beautiful words, but transformed choices create beautiful relationships. Watch for consistency. Watch for courage. Watch for whether their actions finally match the depth they claim to feel. Do not be hypnotized by intensity alone. A sincere heart will eventually become visible through behavior. And strangely, this is something your soulmate is beginning to understand too. They know words will not be enough. That is why another part of today's emotional moment was so powerful. They began thinking about what they would actually need to do if they wanted to approach you differently. Not what they would say. What they would do. Where would they need to take responsibility? What confusion would they need to clear? What apology might be necessary? What truth have they still been avoiding? What old influence, fear, or habit would they need to stop allowing into this connection? As those questions surfaced, your soulmate became quieter. Because one answer appeared again and again. There is something they never told you. Something connected to why they pulled away, hesitated, or behaved in a way that did not match what they felt. And this is where today's tears became almost impossible to stop. They realized that you may have blamed yourself for something that was never truly about you. You may have wondered whether you were too much, not enough, too emotional, too quiet, too available, too distant, too complicated, or simply not the person they wanted. But the hidden truth points somewhere else. Your soulmate was carrying a fear they never explained. A fear rooted in an earlier experience. Something happened before you, something that taught them to associate deep attachment with possible loss. They may have promised themselves they would never again become so emotionally dependent on another person's presence. Then you entered their life, and without trying, you reached the exact place they had protected. At first, they loved it. Then they feared it. Because suddenly you mattered enough to hurt them. And instead of admitting that vulnerability, they created distance. This does not excuse everything. But it explains something. Today, they finally saw the connection between an old wound and the way they treated a new possibility. They realized they had been responding to you as though you were someone from their past. They expected endings before beginnings had been given a chance. They prepared for abandonment while you were still trying to stay. They searched for hidden danger in moments that may have simply required trust. And the moment they understood this, they cried for both of you. For themselves, because fear had been steering them. For you, because you may have experienced the consequences without ever being told the reason. That was the moment they whispered something they never expected to say. Not necessarily aloud where anyone could hear. Perhaps only within themselves. I wish I had told them. Those words changed everything. Because regret is often the doorway through which responsibility enters. But regret alone is not enough. The question now is whether they will turn realization into courage. And something tells me the answer may come sooner than you expect. There is movement around this connection, but do not interpret movement as a guarantee of a particular outcome. This is not about predicting your future as though your choices do not matter. It is about recognizing the emotional crossroads that exists in this story. Your soulmate is being confronted with themselves. You are being invited to remember your worth. And somewhere between those two awakenings, a new possibility is forming. Maybe the next chapter is reconciliation. Maybe it is closure. Maybe it is finally hearing the truth that frees both hearts from uncertainty. Whatever form it takes, clarity is approaching the center of this story. That is why you must remain grounded. Do not chase the revelation. Let truth come toward you. You have spent enough time trying to understand what someone else would not explain. If they have something meaningful to say, let them develop the courage to say it clearly. If they want a place in your life, let them show you why that place will be treated differently now. Your heart deserves peace while answers unfold. And yet, there is still one more detail about today that you have not heard. One detail that changed your soulmate's tears from quiet sadness into something almost impossible for them to contain. Someone said something about you. A person your soulmate did not expect to hear it from. The conversation was not supposed to become emotional. Your name may not even have been the original subject. But somehow, the discussion turned toward you, and this person shared an observation that your soulmate had secretly been trying to deny. At first, your soulmate said very little. They listened. Then the person mentioned something about the way your soulmate changes whenever your name comes up. That sentence struck a nerve. Your soulmate tried to brush it aside. But the person continued. They said they had noticed your soulmate becoming quieter after certain conversations, checking their phone differently, losing focus when something reminded them of you. They said something even more unexpected, that no matter how hard your soulmate tried to act detached, their behavior told another story. Your soulmate froze. Because someone else had seen it. The feeling they believed they had hidden was not hidden at all. And then the person asked them one question. A very simple question. But it landed directly on the truth. If you still care this much, why haven't you told them? Your soulmate had no answer. They looked away. Their throat tightened. Everything they had been avoiding suddenly stood in front of them in one sentence. Why haven't you told them? Not why haven't you forgotten them? Not why haven't you moved on? Why haven't you told them? And that question stayed with them even after the conversation ended. They carried it into silence. They repeated it internally. They tried to answer logically. Timing. Fear. Circumstances. Pride. Uncertainty. But none of those answers brought peace. Because beneath all of them was the truth they had avoided from the beginning. They were afraid that once they told you how deeply they cared, everything would become real. And real love requires real courage. Today, they finally understood the price of avoiding that courage. That is why they cried. But even that was not the biggest revelation. Because after the tears slowed, your soulmate did something they had not planned to do. They reached for their phone. Your name was there. For several seconds, they simply stared at it. Their heart began racing. They opened something connected to you, a message, a conversation, a photograph, perhaps a memory they had kept longer than you realize. Then they began typing. The first words were cautious. Then they erased them. They tried again. This time they wrote more. Much more. Everything they had been afraid to say started pouring onto the screen. They admitted something about the past. They admitted something about their feelings. And then they typed one sentence that would completely change the way you understand why they pulled away in the first place. Their finger hovered above the screen. They read the sentence again. Their eyes filled with tears. And just before they decided whether to send it, something happened that made them stop, because the message contained a truth about you, about them, and about the real reason this connection changed that you have never heard before.